As a kid, what I noticed most about Dad was his level of dedication. He dedicated himself to whatever he did. So he always had important church callings, and he was dedicated to them. He would. I was his home teaching companion for a while, and we'd go, very regularly, and we'd ask all the right questions. He'd always go to all his church meetings. In fact, on Sundays we didn't see him a whole lot because of that. He was very dedicated to his job. He worked long hours sometimes, and especially when it was time to get grants in or something like that. And just to give another example, like take coaching. Like he coached our soccer teams. I've coached my kids' soccer team before, but he took it to another level. Like if he was going to do something, he was dedicated. So he went to all these courses and got some level of certification as some type of coach, and then he'd watch movies and read books on how to be a better soccer coach. And anyway, he's dedicated. So I noticed that as a kid, that if my dad ever took something on, he was serious about it, and he would do it as best he could. And that's a pretty rare trait, and that served him well. He was very successful in everything that he did because of that, I think.
How disciplined Dad always was. It was, his church callings were pretty time intensive growing up. He was in the bishopric, he was on the high council, and it seems like every Sunday he had to, or at least chose to, woke up at like 6. Where I was thinking, no, I'll sleep in as much as I can on Sunday, for heaven's sake. But no, he always chose to wake up early. And I mean, every other day, he wasn't one to sleep in. He was one to get up, get going, and get it done. So yeah, his discipline was a big deal.
I could tell he was always really busy, but I think something that I took from that was that he was always very, very, very disciplined with himself and very hardworking. And truly, I don't know that it was something that I recognized as much in childhood, but that did stay with me into, my young adulthood and till now, just admiring that and appreciating that. And I especially recognized it because I think that was something that I looked for in a husband. And I found that in my husband, in Sam. He's very hardworking, and I appreciate it a lot.
One of the things that absolutely stuck out is kind of you can call it being a stickler, you can call it being strict, but he was very much a fan of following the rules. Obedience was big with Dad, and you do it the right way. If you're responsible for this, you do it the right way, and you do what it takes to do it the right way. A couple examples of that, I got paid one summer to go paint the lines on all the fields in like Provo and Orem recreation. And so I would go, mostly soccer fields. So we had all the gear and all the spray paint and everything, and we'd go and get it all loaded up. And most of the time, I would just, there was kind of the outline of the previous lines, and so I would just go along the outline of that line and kind of fill it all up. And it wasn't perfectly straight, but it was enough for the recreation leagues. But when Dad came with me to do it once, it was, oh no, this isn't you just kind of eyeball the line on the next one. No, it was, we had tape measurers, we had string, we had wooden stakes, we had all papers showing the proper dimensions of soccer fields, and we paced it out, we measured it all out, we put it in stakes in all the perfect locations, we put string in between those locations, and then we laboriously followed that string perfectly, every single line to the dimension that it told us to in FIFA rules. And it took forever to do it that way. I mean, it was like 4 hours. It's like 3 or 4 hours to do it that way. And I was getting paid like $15 or something to paint the field. And so I was like, Dad, this isn't really, nope, we're doing it the right way. This is what we're gonna do. At the time, it was kind of tough, and I got impatient, but it was a fantastic lesson.
Just commitment to his responsibilities and duties. Dad always took those seriously, his religious commitments and his family commitments, trying really hard to make sure that what he needed to do was done.
One thing I noticed growing up was that contrast where, mom was more involved in a lot of the smaller day-to-day stuff because dad was as busy as he was with all the responsibilities that he had. I noticed how well they, in their relationship and in their parenting, that they struck a good balance on, who would speak to what child about what and what concern and what need. It wasn't very often that, at least for me, that mom or dad would, pull me aside and have to, express a concern over something or try to talk about something. They both were very conscientious about which one of them should come and talk to me about what specific thing.
I would say he was also just generally an intelligent guy. He got things. He understood things. That was one thing I noticed about him. When I heard he went to MIT, and once I learned about MIT's prestige, that really impressed me. And just generally, he was smart, which was kind of funny on occasion, because if someone's smart in some areas, it's almost like you expect them to be smart about everything. And I remember him telling me on one Saturday afternoon when he was working on some project how early in his marriage, Grandpa Butler once said to him, actually several times said to him, "Oh, you'd think an MIT PhD could figure that out." And it'd be like a plumbing problem or something. I'm not sure they covered that in the nutrition PhD programs.
I'm not going to let him off the hook here as well. Dad did have a bit of a temper while we were growing up. He was, in almost all situations, a very patient and a very gentle man. I don't remember a single time him raising his hand physically to us, which we deserved at times. I'll admit that. We deserved it, but Dad held back. And that said, sometimes we pushed him to his limit, and he blew up at us. And again, now that I'm an adult, I get it. One case in particular where I think it was Dave. We were all just being punk little boys, and Ariel was probably involved in that too, I'm sure, in getting on his nerves. And Dave did something or said something. I think it was something about mom, something disrespectful, and so Dad snapped. And he grabbed Dave by the arm and just lifted him up with one arm. And Dad has always been tremendously strong with how much he exercises. Just grabs him with one arm, lifts him up. Dave is probably, 5 or 6 years old at this point, and lifts him up with one arm and starts carrying him up to his room to put him in his room as punishment. And I just remember the vantage point of looking up the stairway as Dad was taking him up. And Dave was looking back at me like this, as he was being carried up, terrified, up the stairs into his room. And we were kind of scared at the time, but I think it's pretty hilarious now.
One other thing I'd mention, just very fit. He cared a lot about fitness, still does. Lifting weights, getting cardio, whether on the bike or walking or whatever. He just cares a lot about being fit, and that's been a good example for me.
When I think of Dad, I just think of also his love of singing. And he certainly passed that on to me. I do love to sing. I think he's braver about singing in front of people. But yeah, he would sing often and loudly and play the piano on Sundays in particular, play hymns. I enjoyed singing as a family, and that stayed with me, yeah, as I said, into adulthood. I sing with the ward choir now. It's just fun. I still love the song Dona Nobis Pacem and sing it often. I sang it today to one of the kids in nursery. So yeah, that makes me think of, well, Mom and Dad, but I think the love of singing specifically often makes me think of Dad.
Dad wasn't perfect, nobody is, and we could push him over his limits, but that was rare. And to his credit, that was very rare. I had friends where growing up, that was not the case. Men and fathers that I loved and respected, they were a little harder on their children. And my friends had to deal with things that I did not. And so even with 6 children, Dad's patience with us as we were growing up really sticks out for me.
I will say that I noticed the most about him was his spirituality. Dad was a master scriptorian. I remember very frequently getting up and seeing him studying his scriptures on the chair in our living room. And it actually came through much more so when he was a bishop. I distinctly remember one night when I went down to bed. I was one of the last ones to go down to bed, and Dad was up in the living room, kneeling in front of his couch and praying. And I went downstairs and, was reading, and remember having to come back upstairs for whatever reason. It was probably like a bathroom break. It was about 45 minutes later, and he was still there. He was still kneeling at his couch, kneeling at the living room couch praying. I had no doubt he was praying for the members of the ward and for who knows what else. But that really, really stuck with me. It made a very distinct impression with me. And I admired that a lot about him.
I admired his devotion to the gospel and commitment to the gospel. He was always very fastidious with his note-taking, and I appreciated that a lot. And on a related note, him always being sure to have faithful family home evening weekly and scripture study daily with all of us as a family. So that I think was probably one of the most important things. He just really showed by example what mattered most.
He was always willing to provide answers to our spiritual and gospel related questions. And, to my knowledge, I was never able to stump him where he said, let me look into that and come back to you. He was always able to reference scriptures with it. And he always made sure to take the time needed to do that. And that even carried forward afterwards. I got married and, we had some kids. We moved to Riverton, and Sarah reached out to him proactively and kind of asked him a question about, how should I deal with this situation, this dynamic that's going on in this ward? And Dad, who was doing like a million different things, he's like the director of the Cancer Institute, the department chair, elders quorum president, you name it, or maybe he was on the stake presidency at the time, I can't remember. But he wrote out this pages-long response to that question, put a ton of thought into it, and showed that it really mattered to him, that he really cared about us enough to answer a question thoroughly that was important to us. So I would say that's something that, granted, it's something that I noticed then and something that I notice now about his character.